It's a pleasure. I mean, as we'll get into, I've been following your journey for quite some time, and let's just say you
We've been
inspired
doing it for a
a
while.
lot. I know you inspired a lot of what I do back to the podcast. I was an avid listener, so it's quite
Oh, fantastic.
awesome to
Thank
be
you
able to sit
for
down
telling me that.
and learn more about your story. So we'll just get underway.
Okay.
I don't want to waste too much
Cool.
of your time. So
No, go for it.
for those of us that have been enthusiasts for a long time, I think one of the main things we can resonate with is seeing an aircraft that was fundamental to our love for aviation disappearing, and just becoming a distant memory. For me personally, it's the Boeing 747. I grew up in Australia, specifically Melbourne, so it's been quite hard to see the 747, especially in passenger capacity, slowly but surely just completely remove itself. Bring Our Birds Home today features, of course. It's a unique interview for me. I think one that lives and breathes aviation and history, as well as the mission to save older aircraft. And you're the founder, Paul, of Bring Our Birds Home, and I just wanted to ask how you are doing today.
Doing well today. I'm speaking from Wellington, and I've only recently come here from Auckland, and at the moment there's no difference between the two. It's a hot day in Wellington, probably the hottest so far, good mid-20s. Crazy traffic out there, but apart from that, I'm doing well, and I always like to talk about what we're doing, so I'm doing even better.
Perfect. I can't say the same with regards to traffic. I'm currently in the eastern part of Canada, a town that has borderline a couple tens of thousands of people. So let's just say the rush hour is very different here to what I'm also, and I'm sure you're used to normally.
Yeah.
With the structure of today's, I guess you could say, discussion, we'll take a little bit of a look into you, Bring Our Birds Home, some of the campaigns and the future outlook. As I always like to do, I think there's a story around Bring Our Birds Home, but I also think there's a story around you, the person that is so passionate about it and making it all happen. And I think one of the easiest things to see about you and learn is just your, I guess you could say, career thus far in the radio and TV broadcasting scene. Now, for me, that's something of heightened interest. I've always found it fascinating and a world that has so much richness to it. So I'd love to learn more about your journey from the early years to where we are now and all the experiences you've had.
Well, the early years, I started pretty young. 16 is when I got into the broadcasting business. For some unknown reason, I fluked an audition test at Radio New Zealand. My mother told me because she, I don't think, had too much faith in me after or approaching school leaving, and like many mothers do with their sons. And she kind of asked me what I wanted to do, and I could think of broadcasting, being a radio announcer, being a journalist, or being, I think it was a film editor. And she said, okay, well, that's good to know. I'll help you write letters for those three, and then you kind of, good luck. I didn't get a reply from the local paper. The film unit, which was a government-run operation back then, we're talking about 1979, early 80, was not taking any new cadets as they were back in the day. But I did get a response from Radio New Zealand, which was the big, I guess, CBNC, is it? Or C, whatever your acronym is for the Canadian Broadcasting, kind of the same, but, rewind 40 years. Went in, did an audition, and I passed. And I was in the system, got hired as a broadcasting cadet. I don't know if that happens these days, so that was a great grounding. Ended up on a music radio station pretty soon, which was kind of cool. And then sort of went through the years and went to different branches of the media as part of the journey. Eventually got into film video making, became a production engineer myself. I'm an audio engineer, built a couple of audio studios along the way. I'm a voiceover artist, newsreader, and I currently work for an online talk station in New Zealand called The Platform, which is set up by an old colleague of mine, and I've come in to put some grunt in to launch that with production and audio imaging and so on and so forth. So that's sort of in a very quick way the professional journey in and out of jobs and businesses that I've run. So it's been quite a it's been quite a ride. I remember my father saying, well, he didn't think that was a real job when I first started, and now I can quite happily say to him, because he's still going, that it's been a good career to me, so I can't complain about that. But I've always kept my interest in aviation, have becoming a commercial pilot over the time. I've had a couple of opportunities, but timing and family and things didn't really allow that me to jump horses. But I've always sort of hung around like a groupie. The business and the sort of enthusiast side of it, and I started making or filming aircraft. I did a lot of work with that, particularly through the late 90s and mid 2000s, and ended up doing Air New Zealand's air-to-air shoot. I remember doing one with the 747. That might even be the one. It looks like a Rolls-Royce powered one you got there. NBT was the one we filmed. So, and I did a 767 and a few others back in the day. So I kind of got to live the dream that way, and then sort of got more into the stock part of it, and that's kind of where I've got to now with it. Yeah.
So quite the journey, and I guess you could say, especially in the media scene, almost a jack of all trades, if you will. You've been there, done that, explored, and I'm sure there's more areas as well, but you've definitely been around and done each different sector, I guess you could say, of the industry. I have actually had a look at some of the films that are on the Airside TV channel, which I thought were brilliant, and especially brought back a lot of history and a lot of memories. Some before my time, but some very much in and around my time. And I think, again, that really just highlights the passion for the industry that you have to be doing these projects on the side, I'm sure, of a busy life. And something that on that specific YouTube channel you had is that NZ Aviation podcast, which was running for a considerable period. I know it inspired me with what I do. Tell me a little bit more about the podcast, how it came about, and I guess the enjoyment you had while creating it on the side of, I'm sure, everything else.
Well, it's been a while since we've done one, but I was talking with Martin, my friend and co-host, today, but specifically we were chatting about this over the weekend, and we thought that we'd bring it back. He's been working overseas, and it's been difficult for him to find time, and there's been a lot happening with me, and it's not a huge commitment to make something like that, but you do need to be across all the industry talk and news. And we sort of, I guess, widened it out into other things that we thought that people who are interested in aviation would also be naturally interested in, and it became, quite a chat. And I think we got quite a following. It's interesting sort of talking about the business, trying to work out, the airlines we're doing, manufacturers we're doing, and I see you've just reminded me, one of the things we used to talk about a lot, and that was international low-cost carriers, is starting to become a reality. There's a few startups now that are being talked about, and with the A321 extended range, 5,000 miles almost, and what to do with those A380s, etc. I see is about to come through. So that's take a while. It became quite a commitment to keep going with the busyness of our lives. And I guess the next stage would have been to somehow monetize it, but that we didn't get to that. But I think all I'd say, it's probably not over yet, and it's the sort of thing you can pick up at any time. And now that I've back in Wellington, where my film library has been stored, I can easily access a lot of content that I haven't looked at in years and years, to bring to bear on that and sort of make it a bit of a richer viewing experience. So thanks for reminding me. I'm looking forward to maybe turning or hitting the go button on that again. And I think there's an audience out there. I have a few journalist friends who tell me that on the local media publications, the online newspapers specifically, that aviation stories are consistently the highest rated. So there's a massive interest, and it's no wonder, because as you will know, I don't need to tell you that aviation captures the imagination of people. Number one, as an expression of technology and achievement at the human level, you don't get anything better than that. Maybe Apollo space program would top it. And of course, everyone is familiar with flying. I was just reading about Air India, who are about to order, I think, up to 500 jets.
Oh, mental, isn't
And
it?
it's crazy. Of course, excuse the drama going on in the background. We get that quite often.
That's Wellington for you.
Though I'm a good part of town, so don't worry about that. So it's on the route to the hospital, more likely. So, they're flying nearly 400 million people domestically and internationally every year just out of that country alone. So, the whole interest in just the general public's relationship with flying sort of kind of never goes away. So it's a very popular thing, a lot of dimensions to it, and it's quite a wide niche, let me put it that way.
It is, and you are right. It takes a lot of time to keep up with. I mean, you were just very briefly talking about the Indian scene, and that's one component of the Indian scene. It's like a massive jigsaw puzzle for just one sector, and we already talked about the idea that low cost has really started coming through. That's another 3-hour discussion. Just this recent order we were discussing, that's 3 hours.
I particularly think that will be a global game changer. I really do. Especially with the new, and we've got another one coming, new types of aircraft. I mentioned that A321. That is a game changer. There's no doubt about it. And you'll see a lot of people who were wanting to dip their toe in the water, and the legacies will follow undoubtedly as they face the competition. Sorry about this noise. We've got a traffic jam outside, so it'll take a few seconds. It's the fires. Where was I? So I think you're going to see albeit with the COVID restrictions and the climate change demands, I think you kind of haven't seen anything yet when it comes to global aviation.
There's a lot of exciting things to come, and I think you're definitely right in saying. And you did mention something quite intriguing to me about the podcast and how you said there is a demand for it, and there's an avid listener group. I think with an aviation podcast like what you guys did, you can very easily go back and have a listen to those from 6 years ago, and I find it very interesting to take a look at what the industry was like 6 years ago. You said it's so rich that so much happens in 6 years. For many people, that can go like that, but for the industry, there's 50 things happening per week, and we're looking at a 6-year period, and it's interesting to see what we were saying that long ago, how it's materialized, how it's fabricated. Like you were saying, the low cost element was something we were discussing a while back, and all of a sudden it's coming through with a vengeance. We've got these new single aisle planes which are overtaking, the A380s that we once saw. Of course, why we're here today, bring our birds home, being responsible for many campaigns, and something I know you are very, very passionate about, and I'm sure, as we know, aviation's been running through your blood for a very, very long time. One of the very interesting things I've always found about the campaigns is the idea it's bringing home these aircraft with their final flight, and I think that's worded perfectly in the idea that it's their final flight back home to their resting place and hopefully where they can be preserved. I would love to know more about the process of determining whether an aircraft can, say, be secured and safely brought back in an instance. On your part, I know you're very critical to the operations at the campaigns and such, so how does all that work?
Well, there's really no hope at all of flying these aircraft again. They're well beyond. Well, I guess it's scientifically possible to resurrect them, but the cost would be totally prohibitive. The certification requirements, we really haven't even looked into that at any depth because there's sort of kind of no point. Would be extreme. It's difficult now finding anyone with type ratings on DC-8s and 737-200s. We've got a few in Canada, I know, including one of our X219s NQC with Kronos. But they can be, though, dismantled in a very thoughtful and sort of engineered way, kind of a reversal of the manufacturing process, and ocean shipped in component pieces and reassembled to essentially look like the original airliner. And we've definitely been in touch with many people over the time who have expertise and experience in that. So the only possibility of flying, and it's hard to know where this one will end up because the aircraft's still in service, and we've got some talking to do with Buffalo Aviation or Buffalo Airlines in Canada, is the Electra, the L188, I think is the which is a fire bomber, ex NEB here in New Zealand, arrived in '59. It was the second Electra that we got to replace the flying boats. So that's how far we're going back there, and that's still operational. So that technically, if we end up doing a deal with Buffalo, and we've had chats with them over the time, but that has a few years to run yet in its operation, could be flown. But the others, should we be successful, and I think I can pretty well, I think categorically at this stage say we're anticipating being successful in short time now with two of them. That being the DC-8 in Brazil and the 737 in North Carolina. The 747 at Roswell, ex-NBV, we sort of are in an ongoing haggle with the owners because as it's parted out, pieces are coming off and the value of it changes. And there's a core amount of parts that really need to stay with it before it's sort of like a major rebuild in terms of its cosmetic look, if we ever got to displaying, and obviously the size is another factor. But that's in progress. But even that, if we get that, all of it, some of it, will have to be broken up. Awfully, there's no point
Very
hacking
sadly.
these things up, and bringing it back in piece parts, either in one go or over time. More likely over time, with the 747, given the size. But the other two, the narrow bodies, the DC-8 and the 737, are eminently shippable. And we've done a lot of research on that, talked with numerous shipping companies, kind of know how we're going to do that now. And I'm just waiting on a set of blueprints for the DC-8. So one of our trustees can, Rex Standers is his name, he's former head of Air New Zealand Engineering, or second in command. He did his apprenticeship on NZC, the DC-8 in Brazil. So that's going to be an interesting full circle moment for him. He'll plan exactly how it comes apart. The problem we've got with the DC-8 is the wing. Douglas made those DC-8 wings as one component, one piece, as opposed to Boeing, where it's a two-piece wing with a box holding it together. With the DC-8, we have to be very careful about if we're going to separate the wing, we divide it in two, at what point, and ensure that it has the structural integrity to hold the outboard engines in the right position when it's reassembled. It's the issue there. I think those JT3s are about 3 or 4 tons each, so they have to sit in the right place. So we're kind of getting our heads around that. But otherwise, we've got to find 168 feet of deck space on a ship somewhere to accommodate the whole thing. 737's easy. People might have seen a few years back when the Lufthansa 737-200, I forget the registration, was recovered again from Brazil. Fortaleza, Brazil it was. That was the aircraft involved in the hijack back in the late 70s that ended up in Mogadishu, and the pilot being essentially executed. Very famous piece of film, very sad piece of film. And those people did a great job of finding that aircraft and dismantling it. And we'll do exactly the same process as them. And we've talked with them, and we've even got people who are willing to help. So that should be the easiest of the bunch. So I've probably rambled on a bit, maybe ahead of your next question, but in describing the status of those airframes and I guess the thinking around recovering them, that's the thinking.
Honestly, you don't need to apologize for rambling on. I find it truly fascinating, and I'm sure there are many people that could listen to you talk for hours. Of course, these planes, for the most part, are not going to be able to fly back. I just personally found it, I think it's a nice way to say it, that it's like one final journey home, rather than saying they're going to be dismantled and chucked on a boat and going across the ocean.
That sounds a little
morbid,
a little or stereotype class.
A little morbid for the aircraft with so much history.
I think the real point about these things is, I saw a really amazing speech by a guy called Bob Bogash. I don't know if you've ever heard of Bob. Bob is the mover and shaker behind the Museum of Flight in Seattle. He's been there over the decades, and most of the artifacts on display there are because of him. And he's been like a gin trap. He won't let anything go, and that's what it's about with this game. It's a long game. because a lot of ducks have to be lined up to make these things happen, especially when you're dealing with countries that aren't familiar. Like Brazil was never familiar to me. You need to create relationships from absolute scratch, etc. I saw a presentation he did when number 1727 was delivered to the Museum of Flight from Moses Lake. Was it Moses Lake? No, from Payne Field. And Bob essentially got it flying again. He was the former quality assurance manager of Boeing commercial airplanes, so a top guy, knew his stuff, very funny, very worldly. And he said, and it touched me, and I've never forgotten. He posed the question, do airplanes have a soul? Which is, on the surface, well, of course, no, it's an inanimate object, it's a machine. But he put it like this, in a way they do. For example, that number 1727, I think it first flew in 64, was it? Or even 63. Yeah, it's about my age. And over the course of its life with United Airlines, it had 3.5 million people flying. Now, if you look at the size of the cabin, it's pretty hard to imagine over half the population of our country sitting in one cylinder. But he had a point. Every person that ever flew in that aircraft was doing something. They were purposefully going about their business. And everything you can imagine was their business. Happy, sad, holidays, business, maybe the thing that changed their life, all these things. And he posited, and I kind of agree, and it stuck with me, that sort of energy stays in the containment area. And it's the story of all the people who traveled in it, all the people who flew it. And it's really cool with number 1727. You go in there, have a look. I've filmed the aircraft. Because the pilots knew it was the first one ever built, they all scratched their initials on the panels. So all around the cockpit on the panels are the initials of all the pilots, many of them, probably hundreds of them, and flight engineers who flew that aircraft. So that's all locked in that machine. So it does kind of give it a soul. I see our aircraft, and I call them our aircraft, sort of kind of the same. For Kiwis, you're talking about Australians there, in your time in Australia, a similar feeling would be for the old ANSET, TAA, Qantas aircraft. And, in the end, and I've said many times, they were nation-building pieces of equipment. And we wouldn't be the country and the civilization that we are on a local and global level without these machines, the brilliance of the people who designed and built them, the progressive thinking of the people who put them into service, because they were done at a time where it was very conservative thinking. And for Commonwealth countries like Australia and New Zealand and Canada, a lot of pressure to buy British. We bought American. That was a political issue back in the day, but people were bold enough to do what was right for the country. And, now we're fast forwarding 50, 60 years later. Many of those people, and I've met many of them over the years, are no longer here. They were the most modest, quiet people you could ever meet, but incredibly determined, incredibly competent, and they got things done. So for the sake of all that little soul point I made, and all the people that made it happen, who many are no longer with us now, I think it's essential for culture, a country like ours, to, first of all, value that. We've got to value that. They're not just bits of metal, it's a junk. They tell stories like you wouldn't believe. And we get them, and we get the opportunity to do that. And I can't wait to get into that part of it. But they have to be seen as equipment that was used that faithfully produced the results for nation building. And I put a very high value on that. I know many of the people who support us and encourage us, and the folks that are still around from that era, they believe that. And when you get down to the final copies, none left. If you don't do it now, no one will ever be able to do it. Then it kind of focuses your vision on it. And, you look around and think, well, someone should do that. And no one's doing it. And you think, okay, so it's not just me, it's others as well. So it's us, it's down to us. Okay, then, What's stopping us? Nothing. Just the effort. Well, why are we doing it? Good question. Let's do it. So that's how it comes together. We're not unique. Plenty of people, I mean, Bob, who I mentioned, he was of that thinking. And he had all sorts of people putting the handbrake on, telling him, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. But you get it done. And it takes time, and you've got to chip away at it. And, I guess the New Zealand culture is probably not too different from any of the Western culture, is that we kind of forget the value of these things. And someone told me once that the commercial aviation industry is very hard on old airliners. They're very disposable, and they don't last long. So it's a miracle that these are still around. And the fact that they're still around is a fascinating story in of itself. You couldn't write the script, actually, when you look into, for example, why that DC-8 is still sitting there. Theoretically, it should have been gone in 2003, the day its number 3 engine caught fire. It had to come back to Manaus, landed heavy, smashed the landing gear. And, that would have been curtains for it normally. But through this long chain of weird events, it gets to sit there waiting for us to come and get it. Same with the 737. It's been sitting in a field in Charlotte, North Carolina since 1993. I call it the Field of Dreams. There it is, just waiting. Now, I met the guy who flew that aircraft out brand new from Seattle to New Zealand in 1968, Warren Schrader. He was a former World War II fighter ace. Most amazing guy to speak to. You'd never know it looking at him. He just looked like a normal old bloke. And some great stories. And again, pioneering. You can imagine what it was like flying in a brand new 737, number 66 off the line, to a small country like New Zealand, the bottom of the world. You imagine how the nation felt, and that flew the first commercial domestic jet service in the country, which was huge. I've got the newspaper clippings from it. It was a massive event. And boy, weren't the British grumpy. We didn't buy their 111. They sent the trade minister over here. They threatened to cut out butter and sheep meat and everything, But a guy called Alan Kenning, who's long past, he was the flight operations chief for National Airways Corporation back in the day. And he flew the prototype number 1 737 in Seattle. And I've been on that plane. I went and filmed it out at Moses Lake. It's the one with the other cockpit in the cabin. It's crazy. NASA took it over in the end. All the EFIS instruments that later appeared on the 76, 75, 777 all came from development in that aircraft. So that's quite interesting. But I've seen the telegram that Tom wrote back to NAC saying, "Great flight, brilliant airplane. It's got my vote." And that was why we have the 737. I met Alan. I talked to him about that. And later on, he became a consultant for Boeing for 737 handling. He was that highly priced. And when I was on the number 173, I thought of Alan. I remembered Alan sitting up there with Brian Weigel, a famous Boeing test pilot. So, all these things are kind of in there, It's a great story to tell. And the other thing is, these things, once they're set up, they last for decades and decades. So they keep on giving. And I don't know about you, but I've been to a lot of the big aviation museums around the world. And I do like to observe the people and how they react, particularly under the big aircraft. You go and watch someone looking at a 747 who's never seen one before from underneath. It's the look of awe and wonder, particularly in kids. And I want to see that.
I totally agree with you there. I still have many more questions. However, I must admit, I do not have the paid version of Zoom. So if you can give me potentially
you can come back and do a Mark 2 if you want.
So after this brief intermission, I guess you could say, we were discussing the idea about bring our birds home, work from you, the journey to finding specific aircraft, and a lot about history. There are a couple of points that I wanted to cover, and I think one of the best place to begin is the idea of planes having a soul. I think you made some brilliant comments there and referenced a lot of people that you had spoken to in the past, the idea that these planes have a wealth of history in them. I mean, like we said, they carried millions of people. It's hard to imagine such a tiny plane, like you exactly said word for word, but that's what they did. And I think Personally, for me, that's what also drives my love for the industry. The aircraft have stories. And look, it doesn't just stop at the aircraft, the airports as well themselves. Those terminals have whether they're good, whether they're bad, like you said, life-altering. The stories are there, and I'll always tell other people that maybe don't have that same love for the industry. I'll say to them, look, there's just stories and stories, and every single person that you're on that plane with, like we said, is heading to somewhere in the world for different reasons, yet you're all come together in that cylinder, as we say. So I just think that's brilliant, because those comments really resonate with me, and I'm sure will resonate even with you and many other people, that these planes have those souls for different reasons. In addition, you made mention of the idea of getting things done and how things can be left there and no one's really doing anything. And you asked that question of why? Well, it just takes a bit of effort. I think that can be applied to many different things and many different fields, many different areas in our day-to-day life where there may be something sat there that we don't do, which may be important, maybe a passion project, and sometimes it just takes overcoming that hurdle and really digging deep into it. So I think that's great advice for anyone that may be in a rut or something they want to do, whether they want to go and rescue planes. It's that great motivation. And the idea that the miracle that some of these planes are still around, I had a brief look through the YouTube channel just before and while I was scripting out the interview and some of the questions I wanted to ask you, and I did have a look at that DC-8. I also took a look at your video blogs when you went over to Brazil and were conducting some of those meetings, and it is quite the sight, and you do have to look at yourself and think, I can't believe that is still around. And yes, it doesn't look in the best condition, but let's just say it could probably look a lot worse, because when you say it's a miracle they're still around, it's very easy to take a look at some aircraft only a couple of years ago that were flying and have so quickly deteriorated. I mean, most recently, there were a couple of images floating around of Thai Airways 380s that had been put in long-term storage. Long-term storage in the idea that nothing was covered, nothing's protected, the paint is decaying away now, and they look pretty worse for wear. They've only been there a handful of years, and that's just the difference between not adequately, protecting them. But even like you said, once that decision a plane is made that it's going to be headed off for retirement, it is truly a miracle it's still around, because 2 months later we can see it being pulled apart and it looks completely unrecognizable. And there's those horrific videos, which I'm sure you've seen far too many times, of the cranes going through and smashing up the plane to absolute smithereens. And like, we go back to this idea that the planes have souls, can be very hard to watch when they are steamed in history. So I find it very interesting, and that's kind of where I want to lead on to my next question. This is not part of the script, but because you just have so much wealth of information and stories, I do want to understand from your perspective what it's like to see these aircraft that you've spent so much time trying to secure, so many discussions, so much planning, and the first time you get to see that in person, like it was for the DC-8, I believe you said it was years in the making, and you finally got to that point to see it, what that immediate reaction is to see it right in front of you to the point where you can touch it.
I found it an emotional experience. I mean, and that's no surprise, because you work for that long to, as I said, to build the relationships to the point where you can just rock up, and that's what we did. There was a lot of work went in behind that, and all sorts of things that lined up ahead of time that I wasn't even aware of that were in place that allowed that to happen. So it's possibly even another story, but to see it and sitting there, and that's an aircraft that I'd seen many times at Wellington Airport. Used to fly the Tasman, which is crazy when you think about the length of our runway here and the rudimentary, technology in the aircraft. I mean, DC-8 was built in '68, but it was essentially a 40s, 50s airliner in terms of construction and controls and instrumentation and all of that. Later on, the INS came and things like that, but essentially it was from that era. And to see it sitting there after all this time, first of all, understanding it's actually real, it's actually a real thing, and then thinking about seeing that aircraft. I've got photos of it that I took. I used to go with my dad, who was a private pilot. When he was off flying at the airport, the Aero Club, I'd go over the observation deck and take pictures on my black and white camera, and I would have been 11, 12 back in the time. And I've got photos of that aircraft. And I used to look at it and wonder and watch it start up and all that sort of stuff. And we had 8 of them back then, but I remember NZC. And to actually be next to it and it being sort of kind of ours was a special feeling. That particular aircraft, it's interesting because it's been involved in a couple of very high-profile things. Before the 1974 Commonwealth Games, the royal family did a tour of the Pacific Islands and then arrived in Christchurch for the Games. They did that tour on NZC, and they arrived in Christchurch for the Commonwealth Games. There's film of the aircraft pulling up, and Princess Anne, and I think it was Princess Anne and the Queen and their entourage were the ones finally get out of it. And when I was standing in it, now a forlorn, truck of the sky freighter, try to imagine the royal, the Queen sitting up the front there. That was interesting. The other thing is, it was involved in a very high profile incident in 1976, approaching Wellington, where it flew low over one of the hills, very low, 250 feet actually, in cloud. And it was a big news story back in the day. And I remember it because it was the lead story of the newspaper for 3 or 4 days in a row with big photos, which were sort of doctored photos because no one got a picture of it. I think one of the headlines was, "I thought it was going to come through the ranch slider windows." What had happened is that one of the NDBs that was used before the ILS was in place for approaches malfunctioned, and the crew thought that they were in a different position. They thought they were over the harbour, and they were over the hills, and then they would be over the harbour, and they were in cloud, and they went over very low. It was a light southerly. Now the captain of that aircraft, Captain Nicole, trying to think of his first name. I got to remember. It's been a while. Anyway, I got to meet him, and he was in a rest home in a town north of Wellington in his very late 80s, sharp as a tack. His son actually wrote the screenplay to The Truman Show, and I found that out because he had a BAFTA award sitting behind him in his little pensioner.
As you do.
Yeah, and I thought, hey, you don't mind me asking, how did you get a BAFTA award? And he proceeded to tell me about Don Nicol. He proceeded to tell me about his son. But anyway, Don was the captain of that plane back then, and he was hung out to dry by Air New Zealand flight operations. They put the entire blame onto him. He was ferrying the aircraft from Christchurch to Wellington to pick up a charter to Nandi, Fiji that night, which is an unusual route to fly. And they were surprised that they weren't exactly in the position they thought they would be when they popped out of the cloud over the harbour, and thought, something's up. Didn't realise till later that they'd gone over the hill with only 250, 300 feet clearance. And you can imagine with 4 JT3s screaming, full flaps. It must have been quite alarming for the residents at 8 o'clock in the dark at night. Anyway, so we were chatting, and I interviewed him, and on our Facebook page you'll see part 1 and 2 of that interview. And Don told me that he was hung out to dry, and a few years ago, or 5 or 6 years ago, Rob Fyfe, who was the head of Air New Zealand, had a ceremony to basically apologise to Air New Zealand staff who were badly treated following the Erebus crash in 1979, which was a huge upheaval for that company and for the nation. Obviously, we don't need to go into what happened there, but suffice to say, it was, the scars are kind of in a way still there. And he told me that Rob Fyfe came up to him and said, "Don, I am aware of what happened in 76, and I want to apologize to you." He said, and I've never forgotten this, he said, "If we'd dealt with that properly then, Erebus would never have happened." Think about that. Anyway, Don his dignity was so affronted that he quit. They demoted him permanently to a co-pilot. He said, "Screw this." He'd been a DC-8 captain for 9 years, huge flying career up to that point, as the way you came up in the system back then. And he went off, started an engineering business, became a multi-millionaire, did very well, and set a different course of life. That is that aircraft. That is the aircraft. That's where it happened. Now, to come face to face with that. Now, it might not be a huge thing for other people, but for someone like me who followed those things back then, saw that aircraft often at the airport, you couldn't miss it. And to remember those news headlines and the big news story it was, to be that close to that is a very cool thing. And I'll never forget those words of Don. If they'd dealt with that properly, Erebus would never have happened. So obviously the culture, the crew loop concept, the safety reporting, and the taking of responsibility where it needed to go, that would have been infused into the culture of that company back then, 3 years before Erebus. And it would have been a different scene. There would have been more communication. This is what he was intimating. There would have been more consultation. The sort of hierarchical structure of the flight operations part would have been different. It wouldn't have been so military. And obviously it would have been that, because a lot of the people who were flying came out of the military Second World War back then. So it still kind of had that culture. But, again, that's getting back to it. It's part of the story. And I thought, isn't it incredible that it's the actual aircraft? I mean, it could have been one of 8, but it turned out to be that one. And that's just 2 things that are reasonably high profile that happened with that aircraft. And that's just one of the stories. All the others have their own stories. Of course, the newer they get, the less history they have. But now, and then you look at the 737 in North Carolina, NAD, 66th off the line. Little old New Zealand bought, we were under the first 100 of 737s and the first 25 of the 200s. We were the first 200s after United took the 200s, and Lufthansa took the 100s. And here's the weird thing. Ansett New Zealand had set up in the 80s here, operated some early Lufthansa 73-100s, including NZA, or was it? No, oh gosh, you start to fade on the regos. But, and I flew on the first, I did a cockpit flight, recorded the whole thing for RNZ News, their first commercial flight in the cockpit of the second 737 ever made. So I've been in the first and the second. And, and just to think that our ones, we were so early that our ones were in the first batch. Now, that aircraft, NAD, has done 59,000 takeoff and landings. 59,000. Think about that. It's incredible when you think. I tried to visualize those wheels touching 59,000 times.
I'm sure you were sat there for a while.
Well, yeah, take you a while to count through that. So again, I'm just trying to sort of express, the legacy, the size of the legacy of these quiet sort of parked off in some field machine somewhere. And as I say, that aircraft flew the first commercial jet service. I've got a great piece that one of the grandsons of one of the original NAC 737 pilots gave me, that he wrote coming into Wellington. It's a beautiful piece. I won't try and remember it. I could maybe send you the copy, and you're interested.
I'd love to read it.
But he describes flying in his silver jet into Wellington on this perfect day. And that day was July, was it Apollo 11 was July 29, 1969? That was the day. I saw the date. And I thought, my God, that's the day they landed on the moon. So that's what was going on in the world at the time. And again, this is the motivation. Probably wouldn't be so urgent if there were a number of copies still around. That's not the case. We're down to the last one. So, it's it's not a mad scramble, but it is a bit of a scramble, slow motion scramble, to seal off the exits and make sure that, first of all, they're secure and they're not going to have, the digger go through them. I know what you mean.
That's the last thing you want.
Yeah, that's the last thing, because there's no coming back from that. And sort of make sure that we get over the line at some point. But I didn't know what I was in for. Never done anything like this before. And a couple of the guys who've been with me all the way through, never done anything like this before, just have an interest. We thought, we'll have this done in a year or two. Here we are 5 years later, coming up in February, but it takes that long, and you can't give up. You just can't give up. And in the end, it's just communication, phone calls, relationship building. It's not the hard bit, the physical bit's yet to come.
Mm-hmm. And you're right with this. There's so many things you say of it is almost, it's a giant jigsaw puzzle. It's also the world's most important but slowest race at the same time, like you said, because it is one of those things where it's the last frame remaining, and you want to ensure that it's secured, I'm sure, no doubt, before anything moves forward. Because the last thing we want is years and years, whether it's 5 years, whether later down the line we're talking 8, 9, of these discussions, and let's just say the work hadn't been done to properly secure it, and like we said, we see the digger go through it, and you have all those years of work essentially crumble right before your very eyes. And it's great that you continue to... It's great that you continue to talk about the history of each aircraft, and you do mention how it's one or two things, and we're completely, while we mentioned it before, in this sense, we're alluding to all the people that flew on it, their stories as well. While we'll never hear about all the 3 million people that flew on board these aircraft and what each journey meant.
I do hear a lot from, not all the time, but in sort of fits and starts, because you think of these aircraft as more of an interest for the flight crews. The actual pilots, etc., and the engineers. I get lots of communication from flight attendants who spent years on individual, like NBV, for example. I've spoken to a number of flight attendants who worked that aircraft more than anyone else from 1999 to 2014. So that was their workspace, and they become fond of it. Like it's more than a machine. It's kind of their home, that does 600 miles an hour at 38,000 feet. Over
ignoring that part.
Yeah, that's right. So, it's so many people have connections with these things more than you'd think. And the memorabilia that we get offered, and thankfully we have a museum where we can display this stuff. You've got to have that. They'll all be perfect sort of ancillary items, supporting items for any display. I always say, I don't know if I thought of this saying, or probably someone else did, but I picked it up somewhere, that history is really history when it's physical. I've got hours and hours of footage of all of this stuff, and it's great. I can look back and go, wow, I remember that. But seeing the actual machine, the actual physical item, that's real. It's in your face. You can touch it. You can understand the scale of it, and that makes it real. And I think that's we kind of owe that to future generations if we're serious. We do, and they need to know how we all got here. How come? You imagine when those DC-8s arrived in New Zealand. Okay, we had Electras flying up around the Pacific. But, now Kiwis were flying on their own airline. It took a bit of time to get up ahead of steam. Don Nickel told me that sometimes they're flying to Hong Kong with like 10 people on board because no one knew Air New Zealand existed. But the feeling of the nation, I've looked at the clippings and the reportings of the time, is that it made people feel like they're actually now part of the world. We've joined the world, and that's a huge psychological paradigm shift for an isolated country, the bottom of the world. I mean, Australia kind of in a way is in that situation as well.
We're similar, but not as bad, I would argue.
yeah, a little closer to some of the action and bigger. But for us, you could sort of stand proud now. That's our Koru on the tail at Los Angeles. That's New Zealand right there. And I don't think you can underestimate those things. And I'm just piling it on the reasons, as I'm doing a cell job, the reasons why I think it's very important. And there's another thing, too, that goes to the core of the culture here. And I've always been interested in this analogy, and I've used it a lot, and it does resonate with people. We've got the Maori culture here. Now, the Maori tribes came to New Zealand, if you believe the historians, late 1200s, early 1300s, long time ago. They came on the Grand Walkers, the massive ocean-going canoes, walkers. They all had names. I can't remember all the names off the top of my head. The Air New Zealand 747-200 fleet used to be named up. Takatimu, Tainui, Aotea. There's a few others I can't remember all the names off the top of my head. So they were built, those waka, 800 years ago, to cross oceans with 80, 90 people on board. That's a gutsy thing to do. They navigated, they paddled thousands of miles. Grand walkers, machines made to basically travel the globe. Okay? Now, full forward all those years, essentially these are the same machines designed to do exactly the same thing. To transport people, cultures, over vast stretches of dangerous parts of the earth, the ocean in this case, and connecting it with other communities, other cultures, oiling the diplomatic wheels, the wheels of business. And it occurred to me that there's really not much difference between what happened then with those machines and what happened recently with these machines. Basically the same mission, but with a 800-year technology difference. So when I try and talk to people who aren't that enthusiastic or haven't given the aviation history in New Zealand much of a thought, I point that out. I say, if we value these waka of Marré, which was an incredible feat when you think about it, it was a successful operation of a machine, basically designed back in the day, a long time ago, to do a specific job and to achieve the result, which it did on a big scale, considering the time. If you value that, how could you not value these?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's fitting. You mentioned some of the names there that then those 747s were named the Queen of the Skies. It's almost fitting that that's the names that were selected, given like we were talking about the trek and so forth. You made a very interesting point regarding history and the idea that history becomes very real when you have that ability to touch it and see it for yourself. A little bit before my time, obviously, the events that took place with 9/11, while I was born, I was not nearly alert enough to understand the ramifications in the moment. I have grown up in an era following 9/11 and seen the changes in the developments to security and so forth and the adjustments to air travel, and I'm sure even for you, you'll notice a drastic difference in those times. Only recently, a couple of months ago, I did make the trip to New York. While I was in Canada, I came down for a couple of days and went and had a look at the memorial and really took a whole afternoon to just explore it, understand it. And it's one of those things of, yes, I understood and saw what had happened with 9/11, but to actually be in the presence of that, see all the writings etched on the wall, see parts of the buildings, it really strikes a different accord with you. And that's obviously tilting on the extreme, but it can go for many different things. Like you said, with aircraft, it's the same idea that you hear all these things, you see all this footage, but then to actually see that plane right in front of you. And look, we compare it to aircraft and we maybe compare it to unfortunate catastrophes that have happened in our world. But it could be for someone a teddy bear that they once had when they were a child, and 40 years down the line, they've come face to face with it again, and it unravels all those memories, which is probably a good analogy for people that aren't too passionate about the industry. Find something you're passionate about, maybe take it back X amount of years, and imagine coming face to face with that once again, and the feelings and the emotions, and that drives that passion, I'm sure, for you to be able to secure these aircraft, see these aircraft again, the ones that are still remaining. And with all that being said, we have definitely dived a lot into some of the challenges, some of the positives, but I would love to learn really more about the challenges involved with this. We've said that it's a long process. There are many ins and outs. There's a lot of relationship building. We've discussed briefly the 747, and I know there was a mass spread of that campaign when it was in regards to securing this aircraft. For you, what are some of the challenges you've incurred in trying to secure these aircraft?
Well, first of all, it's always a shifting. It's shifting underfoot all the time. So you have to never think you've got there till you've actually got there. I probably have to break it down to individual aircraft. So The two that we've focused on the most and made the most progress were the DC-8 in Manaus, Brazil, and the 737 in Charlotte, Laurinburg Maxton, just out of Charlotte, in North Carolina. We've been poking and prodding away at the DC-10 in Cuba. That's problematic because of the diplomatic issues between our country and Cuba and the United States and Cuba, etc. But they know we want it. I've had meetings with he was the former ambassador now, but we keep in touch from Cuba to New Zealand about that. And I've had one of our guys have been over there to film it. And we kind of know, we're kind of confident that it's not going anywhere. They don't really care. It just sits there. And we need to get over the, I guess, diplomatic hump of making that happen. And we're chipping away at that. We were hoping to have Jason Rhodes, who's one of the trustees, owns a museum in Wanaka. He was trying to get to Cuba. He was in Florida last month. But after Hurricane Ian, they weren't letting anyone in. So that scuppered that occasion that we kind of worked out this end. The other aircraft, the 747, we had the opportunity to buy it as a flying aircraft for 2.1 million Kiwi dollars a year and a bit ago. Yep. And we had 3 weeks to do it. So I knew that wouldn't probably not be possible, but we had to secure it. And we had to get their attention on how serious we were. So we had to do something, because we thought that if the aircraft, by some sort of miracle, we might get a donation that would do that. And there's always a chance of that. You never know, but it's unlikely. At least we would have some dollars in the tin, because we know enough about this business now that obviously it was going to be parted out. It was an operational aircraft, passenger jet, so it really didn't have much future unless it was going to be converted to cargo. And that still lurks there, depending on the demand for that sort of capacity in global air freight. But I think it's beyond. It's been parted enough to make that a sort of like an uphill climb for anyone. But we knew that it would become a parted out airframe, probably falling into the value range of what we'd raised. And that's kind of turned out to be the case. But we have to be patient, because that company wants to extract everything of value out of that airframe before they're prepared to really talk to us about nailing down a price. And that's okay. I don't think I'm giving away any negotiation secrets here, because, it's common sense. The more that comes off it, the more the value goes down and the more affordable it becomes. I think 685 747-400s or something like that were produced. There's many of them sitting around. There's a lot of redundant parts that are lifed that we know of where they are in the world, that can be applied to a stripped out airframe to bring it back to cosmetically a complete aircraft. And that goes for instrumentation and everything as well, especially the early cathode ray displays, because they were all retrofitted in the course of service of the early aircraft, and later on they were all LCDs. So all that gear is around. Likewise for the DC-8, we've got a full set of DC-8 instruments, flight instruments, and flight engineer station, cockpit seats and everything. We've got undercarriage that's been donated to us, sitting in a warehouse in Belgium at the moment. We've bought two JT8D-15 engines, which are sitting in a warehouse in Mojave, which will go with the 737, though that came with, I think, -7 engines. So people who are fussy will say, hey, that's not the original engine. Good luck finding one of the original engines, especially the original thrust reversers. We've been looking around for those. There don't seem to be any in the world. So the 747 is a work in progress. I know people kind of get frustrated at the glacial pace, but really we've got no choice. There's really nothing we can do except keep the communication lines open, stay in the face of the owner, knowing that we're always here and what it means to us. And that has, I've had it promised, we ain't touching it in terms of the digger. Don't worry about that. But we need to understand where we say, okay, we've got enough in terms of parts of this. Here's what we're prepared to pay. And then we can come back and say, well, we can pay this, and so the dance will go. But and the aircraft, that's in Canada. I've explained that's still operational. It's ironic that the oldest of them all is still the only one still flying. And the Hawker Siddeley 748 in Bangladesh, we periodically talk to them, but we've got some pretty good intel about that aircraft, and we know that no one's planning. It'll be there in 100 years. No one does anything. They just left. There's no point in recovering anything from it. It has no engines, but the props are still available, ailerons, elevators. It's essentially had its life wrung out of it. There's no more flying time on the parts. So we know that that's there. That's the smallest one. That's the easiest one to transport and the cheapest part of the world to operate in. So we're happy to take the focus off the harder or the not so immediate prospects. As you do, you prioritize what you do. So the DC-8 and the 737, the DC-8 has taken, I walked into the Brazilian embassy in Wellington on the 17th of February, 2017, thinking, oh, this should be easy. I'll just give them this great story about the history and how this can look great between our countries. And it's, it's a brilliant, there's a Maori word, taonga, which means treasure. I said, this is a taonga of the nation. And they said, oh, that's all very well, but we can't help you. Why is that? Well, it's we've looked into it because I sent them a heads up, and it's encumbered in a bankruptcy of Beta Cargo Airlines, the parent company of TCB Cargo Airlines. Beta was quite a big operator in Brazil, and you'll still see pictures of redundant Beta DC-8s, 707s lying around. In fact, a few are right next to our DC-8 in that area in Manaus Airport.
I think I've seen some videos of that.
Yeah,
potentially all the other ones stored around there.
Yeah, the 707, I looked into this next Brennan Airlines one of the ones that was painted up all the funny colours, So again, I love looking back into the history of things. The other day there was a Guns N' Roses were in town. They had a 767-300 ER in here, and it had a South African registration. I thought, that's curious. So look up on my phone right there, and I see it's a former lot Airlines of Poland 767, and that Air New Zealand operated for a whole year too. I didn't even realise back in the 90s as a lease. So I always like looking into the background of these things.
It's brilliant to see these ones and go through the long list and look. The more operators, almost the better. You're able to see where it's tracked. Oh, in this period it was here. Do I remember seeing it potentially on my travels? Wow, it's gone from here to here. Aircraft that were maybe fun to you. I mean, growing up in Australia, Qantas, the predominant airline for me, to see some of the retired 767s and 747s, where they've gone onwards as well. Obviously, I have a not as large, I guess you could say, history there on the planet so far, to be able to see all these aircraft. But it is still nonetheless very intriguing to see aircraft that were so special to me and my upbringing now see them sadly either destroyed or potentially still flying in some capacity on the complete other side of the world. It's truly phenomenal.
One of the things I really like doing is going to the graveyards, and I've been to quite a few of them over the years. And I had an idea once to, and it might still come to fruition, to do a TV series. And the idea or the premise behind it, it would be called something like Airplane Stories. And you go into the graveyard and select a jet, and then reverse engineer its history. And obviously you target ones that you know had a history, like it carried the Queen. There'll be a Qantas 747 somewhere that carried the Queen or carried the sports team or had something, and sort of unpick the stories. And I think that would be just as an aside, a very interesting thing. But the things we have to deal with along the way, the DC-8 is a great example because it turned out to be mired in legal problems. Now, good luck being a novice at this sort of thing and trying to unpick the Brazilian legal system, particularly in the state of Amazonia in the Amazon jungle, Manaus. Okay, so that's as diametrically opposed to my world. And when I got there, I saw that it probably wasn't that diametrically opposed. It was still, civilized place and all of that sort of stuff, but not what I was used to. No knowledge of the legal system. So then you start to peel back the onion layers. And once you get past one layer, you get to another, you find out that this person has to sign off something and that person's in dispute with this person. They can't find the owner of that. The judge says, who's handling the case, you can't touch it. The airport wants to get rid of it because it's junk. It's taking up precious real estate where they want to actually expand their cargo ramp there, and but they're not allowed to move it because it's encumbered. I have to say one thing for the Brazilian legal system. Boy, they stick to the letter of the law. They don't make any allowances for anyone. They stick, and that's quite a confidence generating thing. And you find out the level at which it's sort of caught in this web, and you've literally got to go in and unpick it. And thankfully, we had someone on the ground, someone I met when I was doing air shows over in America. He was there doing Brazilian stuff, working for Embraer as well, in the PR. And I was able, just at the right time, to interest him in being our facilitator in Brazil. And then once we had that going, we started to effectively do the incremental things. It's like eating an elephant one bite at a time. You get to that last bite, you go, oh, gosh, have I done that? Unpicking it until you get to the core of the issue. We've resolved the core now, but we need to get that. I don't make any announcements until we've got certainty, because I don't want people to feel like they're being led. But at the same time, and it's me, really, the responsibility falls on me. I have to keep the enthusiasm up, because it's a long time between drinks as we go through these phases of activity. So you can't just disappear off the map and be forgotten. You have to keep a sort of a background level of information and announcements going. And I don't think there's anything we've ever said that we haven't come through with, in terms of we're saying we're going to do this, and then we'll do it. And we try and film everything so we can show it. And that gets a good, the most recent videos are put up, I think it had about 50,000 views collectively, which sort of blew me away.
They're brilliant. They're honestly brilliant, those videos, to get an insider look into what goes on with this. I mean, I just, earlier in this piece, we discussed Brazil, and how you did, I believe, that video blog where you went over there and we saw you going into the rooms and conducting these discussions. And I
got, this is another interesting story. Just bear with me. I know I don't want to ramble on, but
before we get into this story, what we're going to have to do is take a brief pause, do a reset, come back, and then I have last two questions, and I would love to hear that story.
Okay. I was in Auckland at the time, and I got I think it was a phone call from a guy who said, "Look, I've been watching what you guys are doing. You haven't heard from me before, but I got something that I want to donate to you." I said, "Well, okay, what's that?" Thinking, "Oh, it's for money, maybe."
$2 million.
Yeah, it would be good, but it was before that, but that would have been good. So in the end, it'd still be in the bank, like everything everything that we've raised that we haven't used and doing what we've had to do is still sitting there. But he said, "No, I've got something I want to donate to you. Tell me if you're interested." I said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "I've got a die-cast metal model of a 737 200. I said, "Oh, that's good, 1/200th scale." I thought, okay, well, that's, not overwhelmed by that, but okay. And he said, "Well, actually, it's in NAC colors, and it's the registration on it is NAD." I thought, oh, okay, that's pretty special. And he said, and it's the 200th of the series of 200. And he says, you might not know this, but number 1 and 200 of a batch are the most valuable. I said, "Oh, okay, well, that sounds interesting." He says, I'll courier it to you if you want it. I said, I'll take it. But I didn't know what to do with it. So I got it and I had a look at it. I thought, this is a special little model, beautiful little model. Anyway, so when we organized to go to Brazil, a little voice inside my head said, take that model with you. Take it with you. You never know. And knowing that airline or airport guys usually have a desk with models on them quite often. So I took it with me, and we went in and we met the management of Manaus Airport, which turned out to be one of the best things we ever did, because they're our friends and they make sure that no one touches that plane. No one is allowed to touch it. And they keep vigil on it because they know what can happen. So I've got a guy who goes and keeps an eye on it every day almost, sends me pictures, Macedo Sutu, who's the operations manager of Manaus Airport. And he's a personal kind of friend now. He's gets what we're doing, and he keeps an eye on it. But to build that relationship, we went into that meeting, and the guy who ran the airport at the time, a guy called Odini, sure enough, as I walked in the door, I had a bag full of stuff, including that model. I saw on his desk a whole range of models. I thought, okay, I know why I got this. So I went in there and I said, I'd like to present, and we got it on film. We filmed it. I'd like to present this gift to you all the way from New Zealand. And he looked at it, and he picked up that it was number 200. He knew about these things. And it's this beautiful little model. We put it on the stand, put it on his desk. I tell you what, after that, nothing was a problem. Nothing. So never say no to anything, okay? Because you don't know how it's going to end up. And that was an essential part of building that relationship. Since that time, which is almost 3 years ago, we found out who actually owns the plane. So I'm not going to say much more than that because there are people out there who'd like to try and get in and make it more of a problem for us. But we found the owner and we talked to the owner. He's not a Brazilian, by the way. And this is what the court had a trouble with, is finding who actually owned it. Turned out the TCB only leased it. So the good news is that it's really not caught up in the bankruptcy. And if they'd found out who the owner was years ago, it wouldn't exist now. So thank the Lord that that happened, and that that owner has been, let's say, very generous. All we have to do, and that's what we're waiting for now, is to have it officially that there's no liens against it in terms of fees or any other costs that might have occurred in the time it's been sitting there. I can tell you that the goodwill is there, and verbally I've had it that there is no issue with it, but I have to get it on paper, and as soon as I get that, I'll be holding it up in front of the camera and shouting it to the world. But until that time, we've got to calm the farm, keep it relaxed, and keep the communication lines open. But from that moment, first moment in the Brazilian embassy and the phone could ring anytime now. I'm waiting for it. That's been 5 years. That's kind of what you've got to be prepared to get into. And then you've got dismantling. We might have to move it off the airport, though we've got a place to take it, so that's good. And then we've got to get it out 400 miles down the Amazon River. Luckily, container ships operate there. And then all the way back to New Zealand. That's a new set of issues and problems. But there's nothing vague about that. We know exactly what we're in for that. So that's kind of what it takes. And in terms of the 737, we've had to deal with owners who are, first of all, they didn't get why we'd be interested in it. They just couldn't understand that. To them, it was a piece of junk sitting there. They'd taken every usable part off it, and they're thinking, are you Kiwis crazy? And and we've got to be careful, because in these negotiations, and we're well past that now, so it's okay to say, but you can't look too hungry for it, because then the value,
it jumps up like a lot of things. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So you've got to try and be as canny as you can, but everyone has to win. You've got to remember
you've got to play the game, essentially.
Exactly.
And it's a game that goes both ways.
That's right. And so we're over the line there. We're organising for one of the owners of the company that owns that airframe. There's a few Dero airliners at Laurenburg Maxton to come over to visit the museum in New Zealand. And we're just working on dates and times and how we can do that. And once that is done, we'll be shaking the hand. We know the ballpark price, which is affordable as far as we're concerned. And then I'll be holding that letter up in front of everybody. So patience is required. It's a long game. Never give up. Always keep the communication lines open. Don't listen to people who tell you it can't be done. I've had that so many times from people who've never tried. So, if you've tried and failed, well, that's another thing. Bob Bogash, who I mentioned early on in the chat here, who I met and got to know up there in Seattle, 2002-03, has been a great mentor to me and to what we do. We haven't spoken much lately, but in the earlier days of when we were setting this up and making our moves initially, he advised me and us as a group of the best way to go about things. He was absolutely correct in everything he said. We followed his advice. He told us it would take time. Don't think it's going to be quick, because you've got to transfer your enthusiasm and energy to people who don't really want it. That's the reality of it. They don't have the same skin in the game. They're not from your country, but they need to understand that you're genuine, you're doing it for good reasons, and that this artifact actually does have that history. So, and you've got to play that game in a canny way, because you can't overvalue it in their mind, if you see what I'm saying, which could be a problem for us. I mean, in the end, people are buying up 727 frames now in the States for houses for about $2,500–3,000. So that's really what they're worth. No engines, of course, and they're stripped out. So that's the ballpark the market is in. You're going to pay above that because they know you want it, okay? And that's okay. That's why I say everyone's got to win. But it just takes time. But the unfolding story of that is, I think, of interest as well, especially for those who've been following it for a long time. They're probably not looking at it every day, but they'll come back to it, every few months. And I wonder what these guys have done now. And there'll be a bit of progression, and they'll go, hey, that's good, all right. And if we're honestly reporting what we're doing, and it's logical and sounds like sensible steps, knowing that these are the last ones, and if you miss the opportunity, you don't get a second shot. That's the problem here, that they like to follow how it's going, and they feel like they're part of it. I want people to feel part of this, particularly the Kiwis. But, I get so much interest from people overseas. I've helped some Pakistani guys trying to recover a couple of airliners over there, and a few others who've seen what we've been doing and thought, well, let's get a hold of him. He might be able to give us a few ideas. I can share what we've done. But it does have a global appeal. And, the undercarriage sitting in Belgium came from a British guy who'd seen our videos from Brazil that time. And that's a whole set of reconditioned DC-8 main gears and nose gear. There are no DC-8s to put them on anymore. Back in the day, they're worth about $500,000 or just under for a set of essentially new ones. And, he's giving them to us. So, I mean, that's a really cool thing in my view. I mean, we've got to get them out of here. And I think we got the engines, the JT8Ds, still got time on them too, by the way. They came off a 737 corporate jet that was based in Florida. And, back in the day, if you wanted to buy a new JT8D, you would have been paying at least a couple of million. So, it's out there. You build the relationships. You seem to be there for the long run. You're not fly by night. People have confidence in what you're doing, and the whole thing grows. And I see it like this, Daniel. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie Field of Dreams, and I'm getting a little bit cosmic here, but I think of those guys I've met and used to know, who are no longer here now, who pioneered all of this. And remember, they came out of the war too. So they came out of bad experiences. They really did. The men, virtually all of them were in the military. Some of their mates didn't come back. They fought for this country, and we forget that sometimes. So I kind of bundle that in as well. But I imagine them sitting out in that field, and they're just waiting to come out. And they're saying to us, come on, hurry up, we want to come out. Finish it, get it done. And I'm kind of, hopefully we'll feel that, when I can say, at the moment, I mean, getting them physically home, it's going to be one hell of an event, I can tell you that. Oh, yeah. I want a big ceremonial thing. And, in Brazil, one thing I'm really aware of being up there is seeing how the local culture is there, the Amazonian people, and the colorful nature of the stuff they wear. Now, I can see our Maori people, given that waka analogy that I gave you before, and the Amazonian people who've looked after our taonga, our treasure. Essentially, they've looked after it. They've preserved it. They haven't destroyed it. It's been in safe hands, as it's turned out, for whatever reason. I'd like to see that come together in something, and hopefully we can catch it on film. I think it'd be a great documentary, the recovery of that frame and the others, if we the more we achieve. And I see those old guys and girls walking out of that field saying, what took you so long? And those beautiful moments where the peoples can come together. This will be one of the most significant things between New Zealand and Brazil that's ever happened when it happens, because of the cultural significance of it and the humanness of it. I really believe that. I'm so looking forward to that happening. I hope and I pray it does. I'm pretty sure it will. But again, that's the energy. And it's not just me. The others feel this way as well. Like I say, Rex, who's one of our trustees, did his apprenticeship on the DC-8 and ended up, I think, he was either second command or head of Air New Zealand Engineering. So, you know, and he's retired now. So that covers that whole stretch. And I'll be thinking of Warren Schrader when we get that 737 airframe back. And I'll be thinking of Dave Thomas and the piece he wrote from that cockpit coming into it. I'll be thinking of those people.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be
all
thinking
fundamental
of
to the story.
Totally. And when we display them, and that's not my job. I don't know anything about displaying aircraft. I can offer suggestions, but I can wrap around multimedia stuff around it because of my film library I have and the other resources. And how long it takes to put these things back together. Even in pieces, they're displayable, given the historic significance. But it's for people who know what they're doing to put that whole thing together. But when they come back and they're sitting there gleaming like they did when they're brand new, I think it's going to be just one of the most magic things. And in the area that we're going to have them located, I don't know how familiar you are with New Zealand, but Wanaka is in the heart of the tourism sector of New Zealand, close to Queenstown.
I've had the pleasure of actually visiting Wanaka before.
Well, you know the backdrop there. It's a great atmosphere to store old planes.
Spectacular area.
It'll be a huge draw card internationally. We put the last remaining passenger Convair 580 into there a few months ago. New Zealand's first Banderanti is there now. We managed to just pick that up along the way. We've got a DC-3 there now, and the collection's really starting to grow. And if we can never do the 747, there's ideas for accommodation, using them for accommodation and a supporting business model. So we've got all these ideas. How long it takes, I don't know. The people who do their thing when it comes to that will do their thing. But just to have them recovered at home, safe, and you can always do something with them. But once they're gone, and they're the last ones, it's just a figment of your imagination all over again. So we don't want that to happen.
Of course. I think it's a testament to you and many people that have all been involved with this, the character, to be able to draw in these very valuable donations, as you said, and people giving you, whether it be that model, whether it be specific parts that used to hold so much value, and to you hold so much value. To someone else, it may be junk, but of course, I think one person's junk is another person's treasure. Well, it's a saying
I'd say, there's in aviation, there's the sound of the Merlin. There's the sound of the Dart turboprop, and then there's the sound of the JT8D. And that tells me the jet era. That's what that noise is. There's nothing beats the noise of, the JT3 was pretty good, but the JT8 was where it was at. That sounds like power to me. I love the sound of that engine. It's in the class of the Spitfire Merlin, and what was the other one? The Dart turboprop. The JT8D is the sound of power and progress. It's a brilliant sound, and that engine has really transported most of the world. So, especially short haul.
I think another interesting point you made about where the DC-8 is stored and how you said someone was always routinely checking up on it and making sure that nothing happened to it. You never know what could happen. We've mentioned a few times in this chat the idea of potential documentaries and series. I definitely think there could be some kind of Netflix special around protecting the DC-8. And it's a man that goes out every day and checks the plane, and there's threats maybe on the outside.
Yeah, well, that's right. Marcio, he's good like that. Every week he says, I checked your baby and it's all right, and every now and then he'll send me pictures of it just to confirm it. I think, I think you're right. If we can weave the right stories with this, and it's, the locations are beautiful photographic backdrops. We went on a helicopter tour around Manaus, so I got to see the lie of the land. And, with the jungle and the Amazon River and the Black River, as they call it, the River Noir, off in the backdrop, and all the, the concentrated living area. You can imagine beautiful drone shots following the progression of the semi-trailers with the bits and pieces on the back. The dismantling is going to be an interesting thing, because I've got, over the years, have been creating a sort of kind of database of people who might be interested in helping us out with that. And we've come up with a sort of a travel business model to try and make that happen and cover the cost of it. But you can just imagine it'll be mainly Kiwis, some of them like Rex, who are seeing the airliner again after all these decades. They get to do a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and something for their country. They can be part of, with love and care, taking this precious artifact to pieces and seeing it all the way back home. And I think I can just visualize the scenes of that happening. I can see the drone shots playing down in my head. I know exactly what it's going to be like, and it's definitely a pitch that we have sort of been working on, especially if there's multiple aircraft involved, because then you can make another series of programs about the next one and the next one and the next one. But realistically, I'm going to be not too bold about this. Even if we get one, I'll be happy. It'll be the way the cookie crumbles, but even if we get one of them, I'll be happy.
And after all that work, it's the reward I think you and the team deserve, to be able to have that joy, to be able to have it safe. And then, like you said, once you have it safe, it's up to you to decide what you'd like to do with it, where you'd like to. Of course, there is the process of unloading it, putting it back together in some cases, but you have it. That's the critical thing. You have that time to be able to figure it out. And like you said, in some instances, it's a long game, but in some instances, you do have to race to be able to secure it, because you don't want something happening to it. One of the last questions I had for you, and this is a very broad one, I think probably one of the biggest things about Bring Our Birds Home, and I have been following through the years and checking up on updates and seeing it pop into the feed and taking a look at what you guys were up to. But naturally, you never truly understand the process behind it until I'm sitting here with you right now and having this chat, to be able to learn just how long some of these things take and getting a better understanding. So I'll reword the question. I originally was going to say, I guess, what's next? We have an idea for what's next, but in terms of the next 1 to 2 years for Bring Our Birds Home and the specific programs that you are working on, what would you say some of the goals you want to achieve in that time frame would be? Whether that be with the DC-8, the 737 and such. Obviously prioritizing some planes over the others, like you said.
Okay, well, the DC-8 and 73, we have to put maximum effort into those two, because we're almost over the line with those. I would hope to have, I don't want to put a straitjacket on myself, because I've done that before. and as I've explained, as you go through this, you realize you really can't do that. But you can't have it open-ended either. It can't go on forever. It has to be, the deal has to be closed, and, the wheels have to touch the ground at some point, so to speak. I would like to have confirmation of those two particularly in pretty short time. Okay, now I'm not going to say what that time period is, because I kind of don't know, but I'm saying short time, so not long, not another year, not another 2 years. Though we'll go, well, I guess the mission statement is we exhaust all opportunities. We exhaust them. We actually exhaust them till there's nothing there anymore. You have to do that when they're the last ones. You can't give up at any point. You've got to go all the way, within reason. I'd like to have those wrapped up, and at least in ownership, legal ownership in short time. As for the others, I would like to have the 747 wrapped up within the year, and that's really just the clock ticking on departing out, which has been going now since sort of March, April this year. But it's not something where they just take everything off it. I think they analyze demands for the parts market and sort of do things in bits and pieces. I'm only reverse engineering what I think they do from the way that we've been talking. But I'd like to have that set up in a year. We have to see what the situation in Cuba is. That's a dynamic thing, and it is politically kind of problematic. And then working out who actually owns that DC-10. Is it the airport authority there? Is it the Ministry of Civil Aviation? Are they all one thing? I believe they're separate things, but obviously it's a communist country. So you can kind of work out what it sort of is like. I can only go on what the ambassador has told me officially. And I do know that it's been used over the years for training security forces. Airports, as I understand it, have to maintain certification or have a certification to maintain their operational status as a an operating international airport. Requires training, security, and emergency services. Cuba's cut off from doing anything outside their own country. So I believe that aircraft has been used for that. But also I've heard that someone actually lived in it for a while. So we don't quite, and we were hoping to get to the bottom of that a month ago, but nature intervened, unfortunately, nature and politics. But I'd like to have that sorted out within the next few years. We need to talk to Buffalo Airways and is it the McBriens? Some more, probably the young ones is an easier chat, but they know that we're interested in it because I've communicated with them quite a few times over the time, and I don't keep in touch too much because you don't want to annoy them, but I never go away. So that could change any moment if it's flyable, because it's the transport part of it's, apart from fuel, is not a problem. And the 748 in Bangladesh, I haven't given that much thought apart from making sure that they still know we're interested in that. And I was planning to go and visit that aircraft, but then COVID came along. That's been a big spanner, kind of in a way, in the works, because we were planning to go and visit all these people, especially after the Brazilian experience, because we realized how that helped. So that could still be some years away. So it's 2 as soon as possible. The 3rd within the year, open-ended on the DC-10, but 2-3 years, let's be real. I always said when we start, I thought this would be a 7 to 10 year project. That was after realizing that it wasn't going to be so easy. And that other 748 thing, that could happen quickly. That could happen quickly because it's small and transportable. We're still trying to get an idea if that's flyable. Those 748s were built like a brick, you know what. And there's still expertise on 748s here in New Zealand with Mount Cook Airlines who used to fly them. Quite a few of the engineers are still around. And there are quite a few parts. There's quite a few parts in Nepal, for example, I understand, that might be able to be brought to bear to get the plane flyable. So that's a possibility. So that's how I see it sort of rolling out. Other people have tried to interest us in other aircraft, but what we're saying is if we've already got them in the country, like we've got a Viscount, we've got an F-27, we've got DC-3s, I mean, we don't need to get another one of those. It's already done. It's the ones that, we're looking at 777s now, 200s. There's been a few shots across the bow to Air New Zealand of our interest in them. They don't know what they want to do with those at the moment. There's no market really for the 200s. There's not many flying anymore. So it's possible that we could do something there, but again, it might not be flyable. So we have to be prepared for that. And also 767, the first Air New Zealand 767 200 is still flying with Star Airlines, which is a Danish-based cargo airline from memory, operating for Maersk. That's still out there, still flying every day. Keep my eye on that. And I've been in touch with Star Airlines, their chief pilot, and they know that it's of interest to us, but they're still operating it. But we know where it is. But, most of those 76s of Air New Zealand are still flying. So even if that one is not available, there'll be or a 300 around somewhere, and maybe it'll still be flyable. I think Iceland Air are flying most of the ex-Air New Zealand 76-300s, so keep an eye on that. But so there's a couple that we might add on. But again, the urgency of them being the final ones available is really
that's where the priority is.
That's what really focuses you. And if you're down to the last one, you've got no choice.
Yeah. Whereas the latter you mentioned, it's great that you know where they are, but they're obviously not as pressing, especially considering they're still flying, most of them. There's a lot more pressing matters that you mentioned, and it's
also
time-consuming.
They don't have the same history, because the DC-8 737 was a line in the sand between non-jet powered and jet powered, and that was the revolution that changed the world. And that sits on the cusp of that change, which was a global change, but a big change for our country. So that kind of makes it even more historic, that it represents a flipping of one era to another,
I get you totally. And I think with this chat that we've had, it's one of those things where I would love to come back to it in a year or 6 months and see where you guys are at. Look, it's fascinating. And like you said, there's so many pieces that can move in the space of a year, 6 months, or nothing can move at all on a certain aircraft. So with that, I wanted to thank you so much for your time. You're a walking encyclopedia. I could ask you something that happened 10 years ago. You'd give me the registration, the weather, the date, everything. It's been an absolute pleasure to truly have a conversation with you and learn more about the history that I think is so important, and get a better understanding for Bring Our Birds Home, because like I said, I'd been keeping up to date, but naturally I don't understand all the ins and outs, and there can be large time gaps, and like you said, some people may be confused at that, but I hope if anything, for the people that do take the time to listen to this, you get that understanding that it is such a lengthy process, but the reward, hopefully once we get there, will be absolutely huge. And I want to wish you all the best with that. I'm going to be keeping a very close eye, and I'm sure we'll keep in touch with regards to your updates and so forth. But thank you so much again for your time.
Well, I very much appreciate, Daniel, the opportunity to talk about it. And I would like to encourage anyone watching this who, in other countries, who maybe have a bit of a think about where their history's at, and to look into that, and maybe there's a few artifacts that are very significant in the nation-building exercise that we've all been through, varying degrees and specific to our own cultures, etc. And to, if you're motivated, to give it a go, and do your bit for. I mean, the question is, what are you really doing this for? Well, I've given you a whole lot of reasons, but actually, it's a very selfish reason, if I was to be honest. I used to love as a kid hearing that 737 go over, climbing out over Wellington Harbour, big steep left-hand turn, just hauling right up, trailing black smoke, very noisy back in the day. And I used to think, God, that's cool. I'm doing it for me. and I kind of, there's a kid that's still in me that's never forgotten that stuff. And, I just want to see it again. I really do. I just want to see it again.
I think that inner kid is in all of us, to be honest, especially with planes.
Yeah, it totally is. And, some of my best memories as a kid was, I remember seeing a speech by Harrison Ford once at one of the Oshkoshes. And he was the head of the Young Eagles, which was their young flying sort of club. And he said something, I've never forgotten it. He's absolutely right. He says, you go to any airport in the world, and what are you going to see? You're going to see a dad, their kid on the shoulders, looking at the planes. It's true. Doesn't matter where you go in the world. That's exactly right. And that was me.
And it was me too, as well. And I think that then that just shows through your passion. And I wrote down, I'm not the best when it comes to titling a piece and a discussion. I'm very new to this. This has been the first real year where I've had the opportunity to speak to people like yourself, put through my questions and have a discussion. And it's been, and look, I watched your podcasts and your videos when I was 14, 15, 13, 16. And to then be able to sit down with you, and look, you inspired me to do my podcast on the side. I think definitely played a role in me wanting to move into the media and communications field. So I was just thinking, what would be a good title to do to write this about? And I pretty much wrote down an emotional love letter to aviation, because I think that's what it is. I genuinely think that's what it is. I think that
probably right.
From the soul that we discussed, the soul of the plane, I think your passion, I know you said it was selfishly, but it's just, you represent, I think, the feeling of a lot of people. I just think probably one of the main differences is you you took that leap of faith. Do you know what I mean? And we discussed, God, now probably an hour back, we were discussing how you seize that opportunity. Why are we not doing it? Let's do it. So yes, maybe selfishly that inner kid in you wants to see the plane, but I think also you're doing something that maybe other people would love to do if they had that same opportunity. And I think that's why so many people are rooting for the Bring Our Birds Home campaign and to see these planes where they truly belong.
Yeah, well, they belong, that's why we say home, bring them home. And I must give a shout out to Benjamin Paul Jeffrey, who without him, we wouldn't be doing this, because he was the guy who said to me, I've thought about this. It's beyond me. What do you think? And that's what started, credit where it's due. That's what started the whole thing. And he has been such a valuable guy along the way. I mean, when you do something like this, everyone kind of finds their role. I'm lucky because of the work I've done. I'm quite happy to go out and front stuff and try and persuade people to do things in public. But there are people who also sit behind Darren Hunter, Jason Rhodes, Rex Stanners, Benjamin Paul Jeffrey, Marcio, Caesar. They're all there, and they've kind of all been bitten by the same bug, and they're just as passionate as me. I'm just kind of the face of it, but we're all there. And we've got, I think, about 6,000 followers now. And, that's, I mean, I'm not too far across social media, but I believe that's a pretty good footprint for what we do.
It is. For what you do in the niche that you're in, 100%. And look, I think also, before we do end this, the people that are interested in what you do are truly interested. Do you know what I mean? That passion is there. That's where you can see the interaction, the people jumping in the discussion. The people that are there really do care.
No, I think you're right. And we really appreciate it. I mean, honestly, without them, literally wouldn't happen. I mean, we've had about, over the last 5 years, about $75,000 donated to us, which is not a huge amount of money. But everything that we've been able to do, all the travel that we had to do, all the kind of bits and pieces I've had to bring in behind us to make it work. Obviously, being a charity, you've got to maintain a status. You've got to jump through certain hoops there, all those things. Without those people, this could never have happened. I didn't have a spare 70 lying around. I have put some money into it myself when it's been needed, but that's okay. But without, and also I think there's something about a collective intent. When everybody has a similar goal and they're really quite motivated by it, I think that kind of concentrates, comes together and creates an even more powerful force. And I think with the people who support us and have put their money where their mouths are, so to speak, made donations and said nice things and engaged, I think that's, we feel it. We do feel it. And I probably sounded a little selfish before when I said I'm sort of doing it for me, but I do particularly. I feel it's not the weight, but I feel that those people need to be respected, and we need to do the things that we're promising, and we need to carry their trust and confidence. And I just hope that we don't let anyone down, certainly no intention to. And again, bear with, it's not a fast forward situation. It's the hare and the tortoise. Yeah, it's a marathon, but we're nearly there with some results, and I think that's going to be a game changer. And I can't wait for that series to roll on Netflix.
Amazing. And we'll have to catch up. Look, as we wind down the last 3 minutes of this free version of our discussion, I'd love to catch up at some point next year, maybe, to take a look at where you're at with certain aircraft and how the campaign's been going.
Okay, Daniel, thank you so much for the opportunity. All the best to your establishment, and keep up the great work.
Thank you very much, and we'll stay in touch for sure.
Okay, thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you.